These Venezuelans are fleeing a desperate situation as their country descends into chaos, escaping into neighboring Brazil and into camps like this one.
My women go begging for money at each traffic light. Then we meet and we buy food that we send to our family members in Venezuela.
Rights groups say thousands have been driven out due to the massive economic crises in the country. It's led to food shortages and bouts of violence. It's also led to an exodus to Brazil and neighboring Chile and Uruguay. That's why the main regional Latin American cooperation body, the Organization of American States, or OAS, has stepped in.
In the week ahead, we will update with a status on the situation of repression in Venezuela, the increase in political prisoners, the killings, the systematic incidents on rights by the state, and the complaints on the political conditions the country is going through, such as the pre-trial of the main prosecutor and with the military.
All that is fueled by a political deadlock, and at the center is President Nicolas Maduro. Nicolas Maduro has been in power since 2013, following the death of iconic leader Hugo Chavez. The political crisis began in 2015 after opposition parties took control of the parliament. But Maduro moved to appoint Supreme Court judges who have blocked all legislation by the body. That's led to a deadlock on official decision-making. It's also exacerbated the economic conditions that were already in disarray due to the effect of falling oil prices. Fuel is Venezuela's main source of income. Maduro has criticized the OAS's attempt to address the crisis.
The attack on Venezuela must end. Venezuela will not recognize in any way anything that comes out of the Organization of American States.
It means that for now, things are unlikely to change here, and locals will continue to flee. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Let's talk more about this with our panel. Joining me from London is journalist and Latin American analyst Javier Farge, and Andrea Murta is in Washington, D.C. She's the Atlantic Council's Associate Director of its Latin America Center. Thanks both so much for joining us. Let me just ask where you both stand. Andrea, is Brazil facing a refugee crisis?
Well, not in absolute numbers yet. The situation is not so dire that Brazil would have a huge crisis if it was doing its job of receiving these refugees from Venezuela well enough. Brazil has been immersed in its own political and economic crisis and has been paying little attention to the situation in Venezuela, which is probably going to get a lot worse in the coming months and years if things continue as they are. And Brazil really needs an emergency plan, much like Colombia has been doing for years now, and doing a much better job of receiving Venezuelans that are trying to escape the dire situations that they're in the country.
So Brazil does need to manage it better, Andrea, but Venezuela and its problems are fueling this situation.
Oh, absolutely. Venezuela is in a terrible, terrible situation that's getting really worse by the day. The numbers of deaths, of malnutrition, the shortages of medicine. People are dying and starving in Venezuela, and they're dying in pain because they have no medicine to take care of their illnesses. And all of this flow of refugees into Brazil is really putting a very hard stress on areas of the border that are really not prepared to receive all this. These are poor areas. In some of the cities on the border, we already have 80% of patients in the hospitals that are Venezuelan. This is inside of Brazil. And it's been getting a lot worse. The state of Roraima, which is on the border, is seeing a huge increase in the number of people asking for asylum, asking to be considered refugees. That's not even to count the people that come in and buy supplies and food and return to Venezuela. But let me just give you an example for you to understand the atrocity of the numbers here. In 2014, not that long ago, there were only 9 Venezuelans that requested Brazil for refugee status. And then in 2016, we have 2,230 Venezuelans asking for this status. And now this year, up until February, federal police in Roraima was scheduling 200 interviews a day for people asking for economic refugee status. And there are 4,000 others waiting in line to be received by the the authorities in Brazil to see if they can help with their situation.
Okay.
So it's not only bad, but it's getting a lot worse.
Javier Farge, is Venezuela failing its people and fueling thousands of refugees over the Brazilian border?
First of all, I would be very reluctant to call them refugees. I was in Venezuela a month and a half ago. I was in Caracas a month and a half ago, and I had the opportunity to meet and talk to a lot of people, both from the opposition and the government side. Only the people who can afford to leave the country go away. Most people, most poor people, many of those people who live in the shanty towns surrounding Caracas, in this particular case, like El Petare, cannot afford to leave the country. Second, it is true there's a huge shortage of supplies, of medical supplies and food. There is a community project that has been implemented to be able to provide Venezuelans of those articles, of those produce in which Venezuela is self-sufficient, to replace those in which there's a big shortage because they have to import that. At the same time, the violence perpetrated by these gangs of violent thugs who claim to represent the opposition, let's not forget that most people in the opposition are demonstrating peacefully and making the situation even worse, because it's very difficult for people from the shanty towns in Caracas, in this particular case El Petare, and I'm telling you, I saw this with my own eyes, very difficult for them to go to the city and try to queue for food or try to go to work because they are considered Chavistas. And there's a lot of testimonies of attacks by these violent gangs against these people who they consider Chavistas because of the color of their skin or because they declare themselves that they are supporters of the government. At the same time, the low prices in the international markets of oil have made it very difficult for President Maduro to manage the situation. No, even this organization called Interlaces, which is an independent pollster, which has reached the conclusion based on an independent research that most Venezuelans don't want regime change. They don't want the change of government. They want the government to solve the situation, and they do not believe, 63% do not believe that the opposition will be in a position to solve the current economic crisis. The problem here at the moment, apart from the elements of inefficiency from the government, I'm not going to deny that, is the fact that this violence is making things even worse. The distribution of food is making things even worse, something that happened in Allende's Chile in 1973 before the coup that brought him down. At the same time, those community attempts, those community groups that have been trying to work to create local markets to be able to supply food for people, and again, and those issues and those produce. So yes, there's a lot of elements here, not only the government, but a lot of elements here.
And Andrea, there's a lot to take in there. Let me ask if you do take any of Javier's points. And I have heard some make the comparison that these, what some human rights organizations call refugees flowing into Brazil, are actually the equivalent of many Mexicans that cross the border into the United States looking for work and fleeing desperately terrible poverty as well as violence in Mexico. Do you take that comparison?
Some of them could be, because criminality is one of the reasons why people are trying to escape Venezuela. I think that the conditions in Venezuela are much, much worse than in Mexico, actually. And honestly, I find it mind-boggling and heartbreaking that we're still stuck in discussing politics instead of accepting help and acknowledging that the help that is needed in Venezuela is an urgent and emergential situation. So this is just mind-boggling to me. If the Maduro government is so sure of the support of their people and that no one else can solve their problems, that's fine. Then let's just hold elections. There were municipal elections scheduled to happen last year that they postponed indefinitely. There was a recall referendum that they had more than enough signatures to be held that they refused to acknowledge and hold. There is no schedule for real elections coming up. The next thing that they're going to do is have a constitutional assembly that they're going to fill up with their own people to make sure that Maduro stays in power. And it's not true that we have 60 or more % of the people wanting Maduro to stay. Their situation, even for Chavistas, even for people that were supporters of PSUV, the situation is so dire that they are against the government as well. And the approval rates for Maduro are in the close to the single digits or low of the 10%, 20% tops. And this is a situation where it really wasn't like this just a few years ago, because Venezuela used to be a polarized, divided country, and no longer. Now everybody understands that this situation just cannot go on as it is. The question of classifying people as refugees, I honestly find also that's not the important situation. There are humanitarian organizations that are calling for Brazil to accept that status so that it makes it easier for people escaping poverty and disease and criminality to be accepted into Brazil or into Colombia. Human Rights Watch has called for this. The Commissariat for Refugees of the UN is working with Brazil. Brazilians are also asking the government, many organizations, to accept them as refugees. But the important thing here is not their classification, is that we help these people and that the Maduro government accept there is an emergency and accept help that is being offered repeatedly from abroad just to bring food and medicine into the country. And they're not accepting that at the moment. So I don't see how we can really put the situation into a political divide when people are just dying.
Javier, go ahead. I see you have a response.
Sorry. First of all, correction. This 60% I mentioned is by Interlaces, which is a credible pollster in Venezuela, first of all. And not only that, the latest opinion poll says that 80% of people are against violence and 79% people believe that those who are responsible should go to prison, whether they are Chavistas or not. Second, I have serious problems with the credibility of Human Rights Watch, an organization that tried to get money from Saudi Arabia, an organization that completely ignored the military coup in Honduras in 2009 to such an extent that a group of intellectuals sent a letter to protest. They are quite partisan about this, so I have serious problems about the credibility of Human Rights Watch. In relation to the Constituent Assembly that you have mentioned, I had a meeting together with all the international visitors with the Presidential Commission of the Constituent Assembly, and I expressed my doubts about certain elements of this Constituent Assembly. And first of all, this is not an assembly, a Constituent Assembly to extend the power of the administration all the time of President Maduro in power. That is not true. This is a reform of the current constitution, the 1999 constitution, to introduce, among other things, a post-oil economy and to institutionalize the misiones, these community-based organizations that have done a great deal of work in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of health, which in this particular case is difficult because of the lack and shortage of medicine. So it is not true that this Constituent Assembly is being organized in order to make sure that President Maduro stays in power. That is not the issue in this Constituent Assembly. It is a reform of the current constitution. The President Maduro has no intention whatsoever to use this Constituent Assembly to stay in power longer than he should be. So that is actually, that is one of the problems I have with the coverage of international media in relation to what happens to Venezuela. They keep on talking about he wants to stay in power, he wants to stay in power. They either ignore the details of the proposal for the Constituent Assembly, or they try to manipulate it in order to make believe that he wants to stay in power longer than he should. This is a reform of the current constitution, a constitution, by the way, that Constituent Assembly, by the way, that the president is entitled to call.
Okay. Andrea, I know you disagree with, if not all, of Javier's political points that he made there, but I do need to refocus the discussion here on the people that are suffering, those that have crossed the border from Venezuela into Brazil. And I'd like to ask about Brazil now. Brazil does not have the infrastructure to manage this. So how much is Brazil at fault here for not helping these people in need, and how much is the international community at fault for not stepping up to the plate to help Brazil better manage this situation?
Well, I think that the situation really requires a coordinated international effort to organize the reception of these people that are fleeing Venezuela. Brazil is, especially on the areas in the border that are receiving these refugees or these people escaping, however you want to call them, is really a poor state. They do not have the health infrastructure or the social infrastructure to house people, to receive them well. They had problems with the health system just for Brazilians before this crisis even started. So it's really hard. The state of Roraima has declared emergency late last year to ask the federal governments for funds to help receiving the Venezuelans and the overburden that they are putting on the structures of the area. But it's something that the whole world should be paying attention, and the whole world should be working together to support the Venezuelan people that are trying to flee.
I'll let you have the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Javier Farge and Andrea Murta joining us there. Thank you so much for being on this edition of the Newsmakers.